The morning sun cast long shadows across Game Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red uniform for the third time. 23 years of service had taught him that every detail mattered when standing guard for the royal family. His polished black boots gleamed, his ceremonial rifle was spotless, and his tall black bearskin hat sat perfectly straight. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The crowds were already gathering behind the iron gates, tourists with cameras and locals hoping for a glimpse of royalty. James had seen it all before. The excited children pressing their faces against the bars, the elderly couples who came every week, and the international visitors checking items off their London bucket lists. He stood motionless at his post, trained to remain still, regardless of what happened around him. At exactly 10:30 a.m., James noticed a small figure in the crowd that made him pause internally. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood quietly near the front of the gathering. Unlike the other children who were chattering excitedly or tugging at their parents' sleeves, she remained perfectly still. Her long brown hair was neatly braided, and she wore a simple blue dress that looked like it had seen better days. What caught James's attention wasn't her appearance, but her behavior. The girl wasn't looking at the palace or searching for signs of royal activity like everyone else. Instead, her dark eyes were fixed directly on him, not in the usual curious way that children often stared at the guards, but with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone so young. Her small hands gripped the iron bars. James noticed something that made his trained instincts alert. She appeared to be trying to communicate something as minutes passed. More tourists arrived, pushing closer to the gates. The little girl was gradually being moved further back by the growing crowd, but she never took her eyes off James. He watched as she stood on her tiptoes, trying to maintain eye contact over the heads of adults in front of her. There was something desperate in her expression that made James's chest tighten with concern. During his years of service, James had developed an ability to read people quickly. It was essential when protecting the royal family. Distinguishing between harmless tourists and potential threats required split-second judgments about human behavior. This little girl triggered every protective instinct he had, but not because she posed a danger. Rather, she seemed to be in danger herself. The girl began making subtle gestures with her hands, movements that most people would dismiss as childish fidgeting. But James had military training in recognizing distress signals, and what he was seeing made his blood run cold. She was repeatedly touching her throat in a specific way, then pointing discreetly toward a man standing behind her. The gestures were careful, almost hidden, as if she was afraid of being noticed by anyone except the guard she was trying to reach. James's eyes shifted to examine the man the girl had indicated. He was middle-aged, wearing a gray jacket and dark sunglasses. Despite the cloudy London weather, nothing about him seemed immediately suspicious. He looked like any other tourist taking photos and enjoying the sights. But something about the way he positioned himself in relation to the little girl raised red flags in James's mind. The man kept one hand on the girl's shoulder in what appeared to be a protective or guiding gesture. However, James noticed that his grip seemed firm, possessive even. When other tourists moved around them, the man would quickly adjust his position to keep the girl close. Most telling was the girl's reaction to his touch. She tensed whenever his hand tightened on her shoulder, and her silent signals to James became more urgent. Years of protecting high-profile individuals had taught James to trust his instincts, even when a situation looked normal on the surface. Child trafficking and abduction were serious concerns that law enforcement officials were trained to recognize. The signs weren't always obvious. Sometimes they were as subtle as a child's desperate attempt to communicate. With someone in uniform, James began to notice other details that supported his growing concern. The little girl's clothes, while clean, showed signs of being worn repeatedly. Her shoes were scuffed and appeared too small for her feet. Most concerning was her behavior. She showed none of the excitement or curiosity typical of children visiting the palace. Instead, she seemed withdrawn and fearful, except when trying to catch James's attention. The man with her occasionally spoke into her ear, words that James couldn't hear but could see the effect of. Each time, the girl would nod quickly and lower her eyes. her body language suggesting fear rather than the comfortable familiarity a child should have with a parent or guardian. When the man looked away to take photos, the girl would immediately resume her attempts to signal James. James faced a difficult decision. Royal guards were expected to remain at their posts and maintain their ceremonial duties regardless of outside distractions. Breaking protocol without clear and immediate danger could result in serious consequences for his career. However, his training and instincts as both a soldier and a human being were telling him that this little girl needed help. The crowd was getting larger, and James realized that if he was going to act, it had to be soon. The girl was being pushed further back, and soon she would be out of sight entirely. Her signals were becoming more frantic, and James could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. Whatever was happening, she was running out of time to communicate with him. James made a decision that would change everything. While maintaining his official posture, he began to acknowledge the girl's signals in the subtlest way possible. A slight nod of his head, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The relief that crossed the little girl's face was immediate and heartbreaking. For the first time since he'd noticed her, she seemed to have hope. The girl's silent communication became more specific. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat, and finally pointed to the man beside her. The message was clear and terrifying. She was in danger, and the man with her was the threat. James felt his heart rate increase as the full weight of the situation became clear. This wasn't just an uncomfortable feeling anymore. He was witnessing what appeared to be a child in immediate danger, and he was possibly her only chance for help. James's mind raced as he processed the gravity of the situation unfolding before him. The little girl's desperate signals had become unmistakably clear. She was asking for help, and time was running out. The man beside her was growing increasingly agitated, checking his watch and scanning the crowd nervously. James noticed him whispering urgently to the girl, who nodded fearfully and stopped her attempts to communicate. The training that had been drilled into James during his military service kicked in. He began to systematically observe everything he could about the situation while maintaining his ceremonial stance. The man appeared to be in his 40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with graying hair visible beneath a baseball cap. He carried a black backpack and kept looking toward the street, as if watching for something or someone. What disturbed James most was the girl's immediate change in behavior whenever the man spoke to her. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and she would shrink away from him despite his firm grip on her shoulder. This wasn't the natural dynamic between a father and daughter, or even a reluctant child being dragged on a boring tourist outing. This was a child who was genuinely afraid of the adult she was with. James caught the eye of his fellow guard, Corporal Davies, who was stationed about 20 feet away. Using the subtle communication methods they'd developed over years of working together, James managed to direct Davies' attention toward the little girl and her companion. Davies, a veteran with 15 years of experience, immediately understood that something was wrong. His slight nod indicated he was now watching the situation as well. The crowd continued to grow thicker. James realized this presented both opportunities and dangers. More people meant more witnesses if something happened. But it also meant the man could easily disappear into the crowd with the girl. James noticed that the man seemed to be waiting for something. He kept checking a cell phone and looking toward the main road where buses and cars were, dropping off more tourists subtly. The little girl made eye contact with James again. This time, her message was different and more urgent. She mouthed a single word that made James's blood run cold. Help. Then she did something that confirmed all his fears. She mouthed what appeared to be, "Not my daddy," while shaking her head slightly. The man was distracted by his phone. Giving her just enough time to communicate this crucial information, James knew he had to act. But royal protocol was extremely strict. Guards were not permitted to leave their posts, except in cases of immediate threat to royal family members or in response to direct orders from superior officers. However, James also knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting the consequences of breaking rules. This little girl's safety was more important than any protocol. Using his radio system discreetly, James managed to contact the palace security office. "Control, this is Guard Post 1. We have a possible situation developing at the main gate. Requesting immediate backup and police assistance, the response was swift but required more information. James provided as much detail as he could without being obvious about his communication. The security team understood the seriousness of James's report. Within minutes, plainclothes officers began positioning themselves strategically throughout the crowd. They were trained to blend in completely, looking like ordinary tourists while observing the situation James had identified. The girl and the man remained unaware that they were now being watched by multiple law enforcement professionals. James felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as backup arrived. He was relieved that help was coming, but anxious about what might happen next. If he was wrong about the situation, his career could be over. If he was right, child's life might depend on how well the next few minutes were handled. The man with the girl suddenly became more agitated. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in hushed tones while keeping his hand firmly on the girl's shoulder. James couldn't hear the conversation, but the man's body language suggested urgency and possibly anger. After ending the call, he began moving through the crowd, guiding the girl away from the palace gates toward the main street. This movement triggered James's worst fears. The man was leaving, and once he got the girl away from the palace and into the busy London streets, finding them would become exponentially more difficult. James made a decision that went against every protocol he'd ever learned. He stepped away from his ceremonial position. The crowd nearby noticed immediately. Tourists began taking photos and videos of the guard who had broken from his traditional stance. Some called out to him, asking if everything was okay. James ignored them all, his focus entirely on the little girl who was being led away through the crowd. "Excuse me, Sir James," called out in his most authoritative voice. The man with the girl froze, then slowly turned around. His face had gone pale, and James could see panic beginning to set in. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" The man's response was telling. Instead of showing the confusion or cooperation that an innocent person might display when approached by a royal guard, he immediately began looking for escape routes. His grip on the girl tightened, and James could see him calculating whether he could disappear into the crowd before being stopped. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice strained and nervous. James noticed he had a slight accent that didn't match his earlier behavior or appearance. The little girl looked between James and the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "I just wanted to make sure this young lady was enjoying her visit to the palace," James said carefully, his training helping him maintain a calm exterior while his heart pounded. "She seemed to be trying to get my attention earlier." The man's reaction confirmed James's suspicions. "She's just excited about seeing the guards," he said quickly. "We're tourists, just visiting London. Come on, Sarah, we need to catch our bus." James noticed several important details in that moment. The man had called her Sarah, but when James looked at the girl's reaction, she didn't respond to the name naturally. There was a slight delay, as if she was remembering to respond to an unfamiliar name. Additionally, the man's story about catching a bus didn't match his earlier behavior of standing still and waiting at the palace gates. The plainclothes officers were now in position around them, though they remained hidden in the crowd. James could see them through his peripheral vision, ready to act if the situation escalated. The little girl seemed to sense that something was changing, and James could see hope beginning to replace some of the fear in her eyes. "Sarah," James said, addressing the girl directly and watching her reaction carefully, "how are you enjoying London?" Again, there was that slight delay before she responded, confirming that this wasn't her real name. Her answer was quiet and rehearsed, clearly something she'd been told to say. The man was becoming increasingly nervous, and James could see perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool London weather. He kept looking toward the street. James realized he was looking for a specific vehicle, possibly transportation that had been arranged for him and the girl. The tension in the air was thick as James maintained his conversation with the man and the little girl. Every second felt crucial, and James could sense that the situation was reaching a breaking point. The man's nervous glances toward the street were becoming more frequent, and James suspected that whoever he was waiting for would arrive soon. "You know," James said, keeping his voice conversational while his eyes remained alert, "I've been a guard here for many years, and I've gotten quite good at reading people, especially children. He looked directly at the girl. "They often try to communicate with us guards, and we're trained to notice when something isn't quite right." The little girl's eyes widened slightly at James's words, and he could see a flicker of understanding cross her face. She realized that he had received her messages and was trying to help her. The man, however, was becoming increasingly agitated. "Look, officer, we really need to get going," the man said, his voice rising slightly. "Our tour group is waiting for us." He began to pull the girl more firmly toward the street, but James noticed that she was subtly resisting. Dragging her feet and making the movement as slow as possible, James stepped slightly closer, positioning himself so that it would be more difficult for the man to simply walk away. "I understand your hurry," he said calmly, "but I'm curious about something." The little girl here was making some very specific gestures earlier, the kind we're trained to recognize as distress signals. "I'm sure it was just innocent child's play, but I'd like to make sure she's feeling safe and comfortable." The man's face went completely white at James's words. The implication was clear. James knew something was wrong, and he wasn't going to let them simply walk away. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man stammered. "She's just tired from all the walking we've done today." At that moment, one of the plainclothes officers approached from the crowd, posing as a concerned tourist. "Is everything all right here?" Detective Inspector Sarah Collins asked, her voice carrying the authority of law enforcement despite her casual appearance. I couldn't help but notice the commotion. James felt a surge of relief at the backup. But he also knew that the next few moments would be critical. If the man panicked and tried to run with the girl, the situation could become dangerous very quickly. "Just having a friendly chat with some tourists," James replied, giving Detective Collins a meaningful look that conveyed the seriousness of the situation. The little girl seemed to sense that more help had arrived. She looked between James and Detective Collins with increasing hope in her eyes. For the first time since James had noticed her, she seemed to believe that she might actually be rescued from whatever situation she was in. "Actually," Detective Collins said, pulling out her identification, "I'm with the Metropolitan Police. We've received some reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." She showed her badge to the man, whose face went from white to gray. The man's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of showing the confusion or cooperation that an innocent person would display when approached by police, he began looking frantically around for escape routes. His grip on the girl's shoulder tightened to the point where James could see her wince in pain. "There must be some mistake," the man said quickly. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just tourists visiting the palace." But his body language told a completely different story. He was sweating now, despite the cool weather, and his eyes darted constantly between the detective and the various exit points from the area. Detective Collins, her trained eyes taking in every detail of the interaction between the man and the girl. "I'm sure it's just a routine matter," she said calmly, "but I'll need to see some identification for both of you. And I'd like to speak with the little girl separately, just to verify her information." This request triggered the man's worst fears. "No," he said sharply, then caught himself and tried to sound more reasonable. "I mean, she's very shy around strangers, and she gets nervous when separated from me. Surely you can ask whatever you need with me present." James noticed the girl's reaction to the man's possessive response. She looked terrified at the idea of being kept with him, and her earlier hope was beginning to turn back to despair. James made a decision that would escalate the situation, but might be necessary to save the child. "Sir," James said in his most authoritative military voice, "I'm going to need you to release your hold on the child immediately." The command was clear and non-negotiable. Backed by years of military training and the authority of his position, the man's response was exactly what James had expected and feared. Instead of complying, he pulled the girl closer to him and began backing toward the street. "You have no right to separate us," he said desperately. "She's my daughter, and I don't have to prove anything to you." But the little girl chose that moment to make her own brave decision. In a voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for James and Detective Collins to hear clearly, she said, "He's not my daddy. My name isn't Sarah. Please help me." The simple words hit the air like a thunderclap. Every adult within earshot stopped what they were doing, and James felt his heart break at the courage it must have taken for such a young child to speak up in such a terrifying situation. The man's face went through a series of expressions: panic, anger, and finally desperate calculation. Detective Collins immediately stepped forward, her hand moving to her radio to call for additional backup. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the child immediately," she commanded. "Do not make this situation any more difficult than it needs to be." Other plainclothes officers who had been positioned throughout the crowd began moving closer, creating a subtle but effective containment around the man and preventing his escape. The tourists in the immediate area began to realize that they were witnessing something serious, and several began recording with their phones. The man looked around and seemed to realize that his options were rapidly disappearing. He was surrounded by law enforcement. There were witnesses everywhere, and the little girl had already contradicted his story. But instead of surrendering, he made a desperate decision that would make the situation even more dangerous. "If I can't leave with her," he said, his voice taking on a menacing tone, "then maybe nobody gets what they want." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and James felt every muscle in his body tense as he prepared for the worst-case scenario. The little girl seemed to sense the change in the man's demeanor, and fear replaced the hope that had briefly appeared in her eyes. She tried to pull away from him, but his grip was too strong. James realized that they were facing a potentially deadly situation. A desperate person with nothing left to lose, and a child in immediate danger. Detective Collins spoke into her radio urgently, calling for armed response units and medical assistance. The crowd of tourists was beginning to realize that something serious was happening, and some began moving away from the area, while others pulled out phones to record the unfolding drama. James knew that his next actions could determine whether the little girl lived or died. All his training, all his experience, and all his instincts would be tested in the next few crucial moments. Time seemed to slow down as James assessed the dangerous situation unfolding before him. The man's hand remained in his jacket pocket, and his entire demeanor had shifted from nervous to threatening. The little girl was trembling now, somehow understanding that the danger she was in had just increased dramatically. "Everyone needs to stay calm," Detective Collins said in a steady voice. Her hand positioned near her radio, but her movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Sir, I want you to very slowly remove your hand from your pocket and place both hands where I can see them." James positioned himself strategically, using his military training to assess angles and potential actions. He was close enough to intervene if necessary, but he also knew that any sudden movement could escalate the situation dangerously. The little girl was caught between them, and her safety was the absolute priority. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice becoming more desperate. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. This goes way beyond what you think you know." His words suggested that this wasn't just a simple case of child abduction. There were larger forces at work. James noticed that more tourists were stopping to watch, creating a growing circle of potential witnesses and complications. Some were still taking photos and videos, not fully grasping the seriousness of what was happening. Detective Collins caught James's eye and nodded slightly toward the crowd, indicating that they needed to control the situation before it became even more chaotic. "Sir," James said, using the calm but authoritative tone he'd learned during hostage training, "I can see that you're upset, and I want to understand what's happening here. But the most important thing right now is that everyone stays safe, especially this young girl. Why don't you tell us what's really going on?" The man's eyes darted between James, Detective Collins, and the growing crowd. "You want to know what's going on?" he said bitterly. "This child is worth more money than you'll see in your entire lifetime. People have paid very good money to ensure that she gets to where she's supposed to be." The word sent chills down. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It sounded like human trafficking, possibly involving multiple perpetrators and significant financial stakes. The little girl's situation was even worse than he had initially feared. Detective Collins spoke quietly into her radio, updating the responding units about the potential trafficking situation. James could see her tension increasing as she realized they were dealing with organized crime rather than a single disturbed individual. "What's your real name, sweetheart?" James asked the little girl gently, trying to establish more information while keeping his voice calm and reassuring. The man started to object, but James continued speaking directly to the child. "You're very brave for speaking up. We're going to make sure you're safe." "Emma," the girl whispered, so quietly that James had to strain to hear her. "My name is Emma, and I live in Manchester with my mum." Her voice grew slightly stronger as she continued. "This man took me from the playground near our house 3 days ago." The confession hit everyone like a physical blow. 3 days. This little girl had been missing for 3 days, and James could only imagine the hell her mother was going through. Detective Collins immediately began relaying this information to headquarters. Knowing that there would be missing person reports and possibly an ongoing investigation, Emma James said softly, "You did exactly the right thing by trying to get my attention. You're very smart and very brave." He kept his voice steady, despite the anger and protective instincts surging through him. The man seemed to realize that his situation was becoming hopeless. More police officers were arriving, though they were staying back to avoid escalating the situation. The crowd was growing larger, and several news cameras had appeared. Drawn by the commotion and the presence of emergency vehicles, "They're going to kill me if I don't deliver her," the man said suddenly, his composure finally cracking completely. "You don't understand what kind of people I'm dealing with. If I don't bring her to them, I'm a dead man." This revelation changed everything. The man wasn't just a kidnapper, he was also a victim. Of the same criminal organization that had targeted Emma James realized they were dealing with a complex situation, involving multiple layers of crime and coercion. Detective Collins stepped forward carefully. "If you're in danger from these people, we can protect you," she said. "But you need to let Emma go first. And then we can talk about what kind of help we can provide you." "You can't protect me from them," the man said hopelessly. "They have people everywhere, connections you wouldn't believe. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've been useful to them." James felt a surge of sympathy for the man. Despite what he had done to Emma, it was clear that they were dealing with organized criminals who used intimidation and threats to force people into terrible situations. However, his primary concern remained Emma's safety. "What if we could find a way to help both of you?" James suggested. "Emma gets to go home to her mother, and you get protection from the people who are threatening you. But first, we need to make sure Emma is safe." Emma herself seemed to sense that the adults were trying to find a peaceful solution. She looked up at the man who had taken her and said something that surprised everyone. "If you let me go home to my mummy, I'll tell the police that you were nice to me." The simple, innocent offer from a 7-year-old child seemed to break through the man's desperation. James could see tears forming in his eyes, and his grip on Emma's shoulder finally began to loosen. "I never wanted to hurt her," the man said quietly. "They told me it would just be a simple delivery, that she wouldn't be harmed. I needed the money for my own daughter's medical treatment." The full complexity of the situation was becoming clear. Desperation had led him to make terrible choices. Detective Collins seized the moment. "We can discuss all of that, but right now, I need you to let Emma step away from you and come over to us. Once she's safe, we can talk about everything else." The man looked at Emma, then at the crowd of police officers and tourists surrounding them. Finally, slowly, he removed his hand from his pocket and gently released his hold on Emma's shoulder. "Go on," he said softly. "Go to the nice guard who was trying to help you." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She walked quickly, but carefully toward James, who knelt down to her level as she approached. When she reached him, she wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered, "Thank you for seeing my signals." James felt his eyes filled with tears as he held the brave little girl who had endured so much. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, many people crying as they realized they had witnessed a child being rescued from a terrible situation. Detective Collins moved forward to arrest the man, who offered no resistance. As they led him away, he looked back at Emma and said, "I'm sorry. I hope your mummy hugs you extra tight when you get home." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding more about the complexity of the situation than most adults would expect from someone her age. The immediate crisis was over, but James knew that Emma's ordeal was far from finished. As Detective Collins led the man away in handcuffs, emergency medical personnel arrived to check on Emma's condition. James stayed close to her side, having become her anchor in this confusing and frightening situation. "Emma," said Dr. Helen Martinez, a pediatric specialist who worked with the police on cases involving children. "I'm a doctor, and I want to make sure you're feeling okay. Is that all right with you?" She spoke in the same gentle tone James had used, understanding that Emma had been through trauma that would require careful handling. Emma nodded but didn't let go of James's hand. "Can the guard stay with me?" she asked quietly. "He's the one who helped me." The trust she had placed in James was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She had learned to be afraid of adults, but something about his response to her silent signals had convinced her that he was safe. "Of course he can stay," Dr. Martinez assured her. "James here is a hero for paying attention to you and getting help." She began a gentle examination while James knelt beside, offering quiet encouragement and distraction by telling her about his duties at the palace. Meanwhile, Detective Collins was coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies. Emma's disappearance had indeed triggered a massive search effort in Manchester. Her mother had been living in agony for 3 days, not knowing what had happened to her daughter. The detective was also working with specialized units that dealt with human trafficking to understand the larger criminal network that had targeted Emma. "Emma," Detective Collins said when the medical examination was complete, "we've been talking to your mummy, and she's going to come to London to pick you up. She's so excited to see you and give you the biggest hug ever." The news brought the first genuine smile James had seen from Emma since he'd noticed her in the crowd. "My mummy's really coming?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up with hope and joy. "When will she be here?" "She's already on her way," Detective Collins replied. "She should be here in about 2 hours. In the meantime, we're going to take you somewhere safe and comfortable where you can have something to eat and rest while you—" Wait, James realized that his part in Emma's rescue was coming to an end, and he felt surprisingly emotional about saying goodbye to the brave little girl who had changed his day so dramatically. "Emma," he said gently, "I have to go back to my job guarding the palace. But I want you to know how proud I am of you for being so brave and smart. You saved yourself by getting my attention." Emma looked up at him with serious eyes. "Will you still be here when I come back to visit the palace with my mummy?" She promised we could come to London for a real holiday when I got older. "I'll be right here," James promised, touched by her desire to maintain their connection. "And when you come back, I'll make sure to wave at you properly. Not like today when I had to pretend I wasn't watching you." The crowd of tourists who had witnessed the dramatic rescue began to disperse, but many stopped to speak with James and express their admiration for his actions. Several people had recorded parts of the incident on their phones, and James realized that the story would likely spread far beyond the immediate witnesses as Emma was led away by Detective Collins and Dr. Martinez. She turned back one more time to wave at James. "Thank you for listening to me when I couldn't talk," she called out, her words carrying more wisdom and gratitude than seemed possible from someone so young. James returned to his post, but his mind remained focused on Emma and the larger implications of what had happened. The man who had taken her, whose name was revealed to be Michael Thompson, had been part of a trafficking operation that police were now working to dismantle. His cooperation with authorities, motivated by his own fear and remorse, was providing valuable information about the criminal network. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the palace and the royal guard. James found himself called into meetings with senior officials who wanted to understand exactly what had happened and how he had recognized the danger Emma was in. His actions were being praised, but James deflected the attention, insisting that Emma herself deserved the credit for her courage and intelligence. "Sergeant Morrison," said Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of the Royal Guard, "your actions today reflect the very best of what we represent. You saw someone in need, trusted your instincts, and took appropriate action to help. The royal family has asked me to convey their personal gratitude for your service." James was honored by the recognition, but his thoughts remained with Emma and her mother. He wondered about their reunion, about the healing process Emma would need to go through, and about whether the criminal organization would face full justice for what they had done. Later that evening, Detective Collins called James with an update. Emma's reunion with her mother had been emotional and beautiful. The kind of moment that reminded everyone involved in the SS case why their work mattered. Emma had told her mother all about the nice guard who listened to her secret signals and had insisted that they write him a thank you letter. There's something else, Detective Collins continued. Michael Thompson has been providing us with extensive information about the trafficking network. It turns out Emma wasn't their only target. There are other children who have been taken. And your actions today may have helped us save more than just one little girl. The weight of this information hit James hard. Emma's rescue was just the beginning. There were other children out there in similar situations. Other families experiencing the same nightmare that Emma's mother had endured. The thought both motivated and sobered him. James also learned that the case had attracted significant media attention. News outlets were calling him a hero, but he remained uncomfortable with the label. In his mind, he had simply done what any decent person should do when they see a child in danger. He had paid attention and taken action. The story of Emma's rescue began to spread beyond London, and even beyond the United Kingdom. Social media users shared the video footage that tourists had captured, praising both James's vigilance and Emma's remarkable courage. Child safety organizations used the incident as an example of how important it is for people to trust their instincts when something seems wrong. As James prepared to end his shift that evening, he reflected on how one moment of paying attention had changed multiple lives. Emma was safe and back with her mother. A criminal trafficking network was being exposed and dismantled. And James himself had been reminded of why his service truly mattered, not just for ceremony and tradition, but for protecting people when they needed it most. The palace grounds were quiet now. The tourists, having gone home with their photos and memories, but James knew that for many of them, this day would be remembered not for the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, but for witnessing a moment when one person's attention, so courage made all the difference in a child's life. Before leaving his post, James looked out at the spot where Emma had stood just hours earlier, making her desperate silent appeals for help. He made a silent promise to himself and to her. He would never again underestimate the importance of truly seeing the people around him, especially those who might be too frightened or powerless to ask for help with words. 6 months later, James Morrison stood at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace. But the world around him felt different now. The events of that September day had changed. Not only his own perspective, but had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. The first major change came in the form of new training protocols for all royal guards. James had been asked to help develop a program that taught guards how to recognize signs of distress, particularly from children who might be in dangerous situations. His experience with Emma had shown that their ceremonial duties didn't prevent them from being first responders in emergency situations. The key, James explained to a new group of guards during one of these training sessions, is understanding that maintaining your post doesn't mean ignoring the world around you. We're in a unique position. We're visible. We're trusted figures of authority, and people look to us for help. A child in danger will often try to communicate with someone in uniform because we represent safety to them. The training program had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies around the world. Police departments in major tourist destinations began incorporating similar awareness training, recognizing that officers in public spaces needed to be alert for signs of human trafficking and child abduction. James received regular updates about the ongoing investigation into the criminal network that had targeted Emma. Michael Thompson's cooperation had led to the arrest of 12 other individuals involved in the trafficking operation. More importantly, it had resulted in the rescue of 7 other children who had been taken from their families across different parts of Europe. Emma herself had become something of a symbol for child safety organizations. With her mother's permission, her story was shared in educational materials designed to teach children about stranger danger and the importance of trying to communicate with trusted adults when they felt unsafe. Emma's quick thinking and courage in making those silent signals had potentially saved other children by raising awareness about such situations. James kept the promise he had made to Emma about being there when she returned to visit the palace. 3 months after her rescue, she arrived with her mother for the special tour that had been arranged for them. The reunion was emotional for everyone involved. Emma had grown noticeably in those few months, but she still remembered every detail of their interaction on that frightening day. "Mummy," Emma said when she saw James at his post, "that's him. That's the guard who saved me." She waved enthusiastically, and this time James was able to wave back properly, much to Emma's delight. During a private moment after their official tour, Emma's mother, Sarah Collins, spoke with James about the impact the rescue had had on their lives. "You gave me back my daughter," she said, tears in her eyes. "But more than that, you gave Emma back her faith in good people. She talks about you all the time, about how you paid attention when she needed help most." Emma had made a drawing for James, carefully colored with markers and showing a little girl standing next to a very tall guard in front of a palace. At the bottom, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for listening with your eyes." The phrase struck James as incredibly profound. Listening with your eyes perfectly described what had happened that day. He had seen what Emma was trying to communicate. When she couldn't speak the words aloud, it became a motto that he shared in his training sessions and interviews. James had indeed become something of a public figure, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. The story of Emma's rescue had been featured in newspapers and television programs around the world. He received letters from parents thanking him, from children telling him about their own experiences, and from law enforcement officers sharing similar stories of rescues that had happened because someone paid attention to nonverbal cues. One letter particularly moved James. It came from a teenage girl in Australia who wrote, "I saw your story on the news, and it made me realize that I should tell someone about what my stepfather has been doing to me. I always thought no one would believe me or pay attention, but seeing how you helped Emma made me brave enough to ask for help. Thank you for showing me that some adults really do. Watch out for kids." The letter reminded James that Emma's rescue had created a ripple, the effect of awareness and courage that extended far beyond that single day at the palace. Children around the world were learning that they could seek help from trusted adults, and adults were learning to be more observant and responsive to signs of distress. Detective Collins, who had led the investigation, kept James informed about the broader impact of the case. The trafficking network they had uncovered was much larger than initially suspected. With connections across multiple countries, the arrests and prosecutions that followed Emma's rescue had disrupted a major criminal operation and had led to policy changes in how missing children cases were investigated. Michael Thompson, the man who had taken Emma, was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his continued cooperation with authorities. James had mixed feelings about this outcome. He understood the legal necessity of such arrangements, but it was difficult to reconcile with the trauma Emma had experienced. However, Thompson's information had been crucial in saving other children, which gave James some peace about the situation. The royal family had also taken notice of James's actions. During the annual honors ceremony, he was awarded the Royal Victorian Medal for his service. The citation read, "For exceptional devotion to duty and extraordinary service in protecting a vulnerable member of the public." James was deeply honored, though he continued to insist that Emma deserved the real credit for her courage. As James stood at his post on this particular morning, he noticed a school group approaching the palace gates. Among the excited children, he spotted one girl who seemed quieter than the others. Staying close to her teacher and watching the adults around her with careful eyes, it reminded him so much of Emma. That first day, James made sure to make eye contact with the girl and give her a reassuring smile. She smiled back shyly, and James felt confident that she was simply reserved rather than distressed. But he continued to observe her throughout the group's visit, applying the lessons he had learned about the importance of truly seeing the people around him. The girl's teacher later approached James to thank him for his kind attention to the students. "You made quite an impression on Sarah," she said. "She's been through some difficult times recently with her parents' divorce, and she mentioned that the nice guard made her feel safe." These moments reminded James daily of why his experience with Emma had been so important. It wasn't just about one dramatic rescue. It was about creating an awareness and sensitivity that could help people in countless small but significant ways. as his shift ended that day. James walked past the spot where Emma had stood 6 months earlier. The memory was still vivid, but now it filled him with satisfaction rather than anxiety. Emma was thriving at home with her mother. The criminals who had targeted her were facing justice, and the awareness raised by her rescue was helping other children around the world. James had learned that being a protector meant more than wearing a uniform or carrying out ceremonial duties. It meant paying attention, trusting instincts, and being willing to act when someone needed help. Emma had taught him that sometimes the most important communication happens without words, and that courage comes in many forms, from a 7-year-old girl making desperate silent signals to an adult who chooses to see and respond to those signals. The story of Emma's rescue had become part of the legacy of the Royal Guard, a reminder that their service extended beyond tradition and ceremony to the fundamental duty of protecting those who needed help. And every day, as James took his position at the palace gates, he carried with him Emma's words about listening with your eyes, a reminder that true vigilance meant seeing not just what was obvious, but what was hidden, desperate, and in need of rescue.